I watched football all day Saturday. I watched football all day Sunday. You can obviously tell this is a football-centric show when it is football season. I appreciate all of you hanging out with us. And I thought one of the two most interesting stories to me coming out of college football, and I just teased that I was going to talk about this. One, Oklahoma's loss. Now, look, I have learned my lesson about pronouncing anyone as being dead for the college football playoff based on a September loss. But it's hard for me to see the team that I saw playing for Oklahoma on Saturday being able to run the table the rest of the way and not lose again in what feels like to me is going to be a very Bedlam-esque Big 12. And what I mean by that is I feel like there's going to be a lot of upsets. I feel like there's going to be a lot of wacky games for anybody who was watching the end of that Texas game against Texas Tech. Congrats to Texas for finding a way to win. That game should have never gone into overtime. Texas Tech, I'm sorry, Red Raider fans. You guys just completely gave that game away. And look, you end up losing 63-56, but I feel like there are going to be a lot of games like that this year in the Big 12. Heck, we've already seen it. Kansas State lost at home to Arkansas State 35-31, and then they came back and they went on the road and they came back from a 21-point deficit, which was the first time that a top 5 team had lost after having a 21-point lead or more in over 500 games. So it's not just that they ended up losing in Oklahoma, it's that it was a thoroughly improbable loss. And remember, Texas Tech almost lost to freaking Houston Baptist at home to begin the season. So I just don't believe that Oklahoma is going to run the table the rest of the way. If they did run the table the rest of the way, and look, they lost to Kansas State last year and found a way to still win the Big 12 again and fight their way back into the playoff, then I think certainly a 10-1 Oklahoma team would be putting itself in a position to potentially be in the playoff again. And we all know the College Football Playoff Committee is going to have an incredibly difficult decision to make on so many different levels based on how many games were played, how do you assess the overall quality of a conference without out-of-conference games. It's going to be one of the most difficult College Football Playoff Selection Committee decisions that has ever existed in a playoff era. But I'm not going to go ahead and toss a bunch of dirt on the grave of Oklahoma, even though I think it was a bad loss, even though I think if you're Oklahoma, you have to sit back and say, wait a minute, why can we not get our defense figured out? What is it just a function of the way we play offense that we're always going to be in a position where we're giving up 30-plus in games such as these and it's impossible to completely pull away? I think those are interesting questions that need to be answered. But that was one of my big takeaways. The biggest takeaway was we have been debating in college football, what would Mike Leach be like with SEC caliber talent and be able to coach those guys? Because he certainly hasn't had SEC caliber talent at Texas Tech, and he certainly hasn't had SEC caliber talent at Washington State, yet he has found a way to scheme his teams in both places to really incredibly successful seasons. And that question has been out there. If you were sitting around in a bar and you're a big college football fan, you have buddies or you have made the argument or you've sat around and you said, I wonder what Mike Leach would be able to do if he was ever in the SEC, or we still don't know the answer to this, if he ever really got a top job. Mike Leach, by the way, scheduled to join the program in the final hour today, Mississippi State's head coach. So if you're just listening for a few minutes, make sure you download the podcast and don't miss it. But that question has been out there for a very, very long time. How would he do? And to me, it's a fascinating question, and we got a world of an answer when Mississippi State went on the road and won at LSU as a over 2-touchdown underdog. And in particular, I was left with a question. One, props to Mississippi State, props to Mike Leach, props to KJ Costello, the most successful passer in the history of the SEC. The guy threw for over 600 yards And Dub, you can look this up. I think they only ran it for like 14 yards. So it wasn't like it was some sort of balanced offensive attack. They threw the ball for over 600 yards, just went up and down the field on LSU, who went 15-0 last year and looked like one of the best teams that ever existed. Now, I know Darryl Stingley Jr. out with a medical condition. I know that LSU had a ton of starters who had elected to go pro or were not returning. But when you look at what he was capable of, KJ Costello, 36 attempts, 60 yards, 623 passing yards, 5 touchdowns. Kyle Trask looked great, and I think he may be the real Joe Burrow this year. But what I was left wondering, as a guy who has sat around and watched a lot of college football over the years, I was left with this question. Is LSU in 2019 a lot like Auburn in 2010? Let me explain what I mean by that. In 2010, Auburn went 14-0, won the national championship with a guy named Cam Newton, who also went on to win the Heisman Trophy and had what I consider to be the greatest single season for any college football player that I have ever seen. Until last season, when Joe Burrow came in with LSU out of nowhere and led LSU to a 15-0 season. The reason why the analogy is somewhat interesting to me is within 2 years, Auburn was winless in the SEC, and they were firing their national championship winning head coach, Gene Chizik. And if you ask Auburn fans about this, and I'm going to bring in Dub, who's an Auburn grad and knows all about this all too well, if you ask Auburn fans about that, they would say a couple of things, most of them. Well, it was Cam and it was Gus Malzahn. That's how Gus Malzahn got the head job at Auburn, because of the 2010 success story. Because Gus Malzahn's offense, even though Gene Chizik was a defensive guy, it was Gus Malzahn's offense that ultimately rolled into form and became so incredibly difficult to stop down the stretch, right? They just kept getting better and better and better progressively. It's one of the most incredible offensive performances. And then Gene Chizik would obviously take Auburn to the national championship game again as soon as he came back and took over, Gus Malzahn would, as soon as he took back over that Auburn program, nearly beat Jameis Winston in Florida State out in the Rose Bowl to win another title for Auburn. But the program's foundation was not built to sustain a super high level of success, and Auburn fell apart as soon as they didn't have Cam Newton level talent at the quarterback position. Now, I don't necessarily think that LSU is going to fall apart like Auburn did, but it was eerily similar to watch that team get dominated at home by KJ Costello, Mike Leach, and Mississippi State, and think back, and I'm sure a lot of LSU people are thinking the same thing, man, especially when you see how Joe Burrow is playing right now, and he took a lot of big hits in that game yesterday against the Eagles. But I think for most people out there who are Bengals fans, even coming off of Joe Burrow hasn't gotten a win yet, but at least he got a tie, I think a lot of people in Cincinnati are saying, okay, if we can keep Joe Burrow upright, this is going to be a guy who has potentially a lot of success. And by the way, how about Jefferson going for 175 against the Titans at wide receiver? He was the top target last year of Joe Burrow. And so I think you start to look at, there was a lot of talent that moved on, but how much of that was Joe Burrow, much like it was Cam with Auburn? It wasn't that the entire program was built for success. It was that you had a team that's probably an 8-4, 9-3 caliber team, good team, not a great team, and a guy like Joe Burrow and a guy like Cam, who is elite and transcendent at quarterback, puts them into a completely different stratosphere. Crazy argument, or do you see it, Dub, as a guy who went to Auburn and watched all those Cam games like I did back in 2010 and also watched Joe Burrow play every weekend last year in 2019?
Yeah, I definitely see some parallels. Now, I don't think LSU is going to be going, completely defeated in conference play anytime soon like Auburn did.
Which is why Auburn fired Gene Chizik.
Absolutely, and that just so happened to be my freshman year at Auburn, so that was a really spectacular time. But anyways, I think Joe Burrow is obviously a huge portion of that, but there's another Joe that you haven't mentioned yet, and that's Joe Brady. He was I believe, co-offensive coordinator last year. And
he was basically the guru of the Joe Burrow-led offense for LSU last season.
Right.
Brought him out of the Saints. They said, hey, here's the reins to our offense. And for people who have watched LSU offensively for years and years and years, they've been plodding. They've been boring. Other than the 1 year they had Zach Mettenberger with Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham, where they really kind of threw the ball over the field. A lot of 3 yards and a cloud of dust out of the LSU offense over the Les Miles years.
Yeah, absolutely. Then Joe Brady comes in last year, and they're running, like you just said, a completely different offense than anyone's ever seen at LSU. Next step this year, Matt Rule, Carolina Panthers, one of the first things he does after he gets the job is hire Joe Brady as his offensive coordinator. And if you've been watching any Carolina Panthers games, I mean, they're not lighting the world on fire, but their offense is pretty much rolling up and down the field. It's their defense that's the main problem. But I think Joe Brady is a pretty huge component of this too. I mean, granted, Joe Burrow is reason number one, and that's well-deserved. But I think Joe Brady is also another big aspect of this as well.